much better on the accompaniment.
All right, so.
Please tell me your musical accompaniment from the rock opera.
You know, I don't have that. I do remember it, but I don't cover that much. I should, but.
It's a lovely driving music.
It is. No one would have believed that in the last years of the 19th century, this world was being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than man's, and yet as mortal as his own. That as men busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. With infinite complacency, men went to and fro over this globe about their little affairs, serene in their assurance of their empire over matter. It is possible that the infrasurient under the microscope do the same. No one gave thought to the older worlds of space as sources of human danger, or thought of them only to dismiss the idea of life upon them as impossible or improbable. It is curious to recall some of the mental habits of those departed days. And most terrestrial men fancied there might be other men upon Mars, perhaps inferior to themselves, and ready to welcome a missionary enterprise. Yet across the gulf of space, minds that are to our minds as ours are to the beasts that perish, intellects, vast, cool, and unsympathetic, regarded this earth with envious eyes and slowly and surely drew their plans against us. I read this paragraph when I was about 10 or 11 years old, one of the first novels I ever read. And it was this edition. This is a 1966 printing of The War of the Worlds with illustrations by Edward Gorey. This was the one that changed everything for me. I can't begin to tell you how many times I have read this book and seen and explored every variation of what is H.G. Wells' magnum opus. So we're going to talk a little bit about H.G. Wells, where he came from, and all the things that led to this wondrous book. Who here has not read War of the Worlds? You have not read War of the Worlds. You're the one person here. Have a copy. It's even got its own little Martian war machine on the back.
Lovely.
A lot of people, I'm sure, have seen all the other versions as well. Now, let's see if I get this right. There we go, look at that. Herbert George Wells was the youngest of three brothers, born in Kent, England in 1866. His mother was a house servant, his father a mediocre small businessman with a reasonably successful semi-professional cricket player who spent more time on the pitch than at home. His mother was very strict, believed strongly in the Victorian class system, and was highly religious, and so it's not surprising that Wells rebelled against all of that. At the age of 8, he broke his leg, and while laid up, read voraciously. His parents could afford to send him to a small private school until his father fell off a ladder in 1875, broke his leg, and ended his cricket career. After that, his parents farmed Wells out to a series of much-hated apprenticeships to cloth merchants. Eventually, he begged his mother to release him from this series of apprenticeships that he was awful at anyway. And he was able to convince her to allow him to take a position as a student assistant at a private school run by a former grammar school teacher. There was at the time a system within education where schools were able to win cash prizes based on the performance of their students in testing competitions. And Wells's teacher took advantage of him by entering him in every contest available, something he was well suited for, and quick and thorough study, and able to win multiple awards. So that's how he paid his way through school, by winning competitions for the school. Wells was able to leverage this into a teaching scholarship at the Normal School of Science in 1884, where he was able to study under Thomas Henry Huxley, noted naturalist and widely known as Darwin's bulldog. Yeah, Darwin's bulldog. Wells edited the Science School Journal actually writing under a number of pseudonyms to conceal the fact that he was pretty much the only contributor. So, you know, this guy wrote this guy wrote this, we've got a whole staff. No, it's just Herbert George Wells. It was then that he wrote his first published fiction called The Chronic Argonauts, which is a time travel story, which, if you know Wells a little bit, you'll learn that that comes back later. He also joined the Socialist Fabian Society with other noted members like Bertrand Russell and George Bernard Shaw. Wells eventually dropped out of the normal school because he didn't do so well in geology, got another teaching position, and finally carried a bachelor's in zoology, University of London External Program, 1890. He married his cousin in 1891, but left her in 1894 for one of his students. That's actually kind of a pattern of him being with a lot of other women. He suffered through another illness, did more reading, really focused on his writing, and then hit the big time. The big time was with The Time Machine. Time Machine was published in 1895. In this, he used the scientific romance to express some of his political views. What if capitalist society kept its class system forever? It was also a satire on the progress of the Industrial Revolution. People are familiar with The Time Machine. You basically have a future where you have the Morlocks who do things. They are the builders, the constructors, the workers who do things. And then you have the Eloi, these beautiful, perfect beings who the Morlocks eat. The upper class becomes these perfect beings who don't do diddly, and the Morlocks consume them like cattle. So yeah, he doesn't let his socialist roots go very far from his fiction. The success of The Time Machine immediately had him compared to Jules Verne. Come on, frame ahead. Come on, there we go. Had him compared to Jules Verne and set him on as a professional writer, allowing him to get large advances from his publishers. His next book was 1896, The Island of Dr. Moreau. In that, he utilized his biological sciences education to explore what it means to be human and the results of science without ethics. Who here has not read Island of Dr. Moreau? Have you seen like the various movies and things like that? Yeah? I don't have copies of that. His next book finally came The Invisible Man in 1897. In The Invisible Man, Wells explored the corrupting influence of absolute power. So after all that introduction, let's get to Wells actually working on The War of the Worlds. He began his book back in 1895, strolling through the suburban countryside in Surrey with his brother Frank. His brother remarked, "Suppose some beings from another planet were to drop out of the sky and start laying about them here." Not long after that, Wells and his wife, his second wife, had taken up bicycling, and they would ride about, with Wells marking suitable places and people for the destruction by Martians. You know, riding around on your bike, it's like, hey, that'd be cool if I blew that up. You think Michael Bay does that too? He just drives around Los Angeles like, hey, what if we blew that up?
I think he marks the places to not blow up.
Not blow up. Okay, this is the one place that survives. Let's blow this all up. And that was one of the strengths of his narrative, placing the events in detail in known places, creating strong characters because they were based on people he knew. We'll get back to that later, but first, the Martians. Wells was not the first author to have alien creatures in his story, but what was unique was that they were actually alien. Previously, men from other worlds were pretty much like men from Earth, except bigger or smaller with more arms or no heads and faces on their chests or otherwise somewhat familiar. These are the kinds of alien creatures that people thought of. That's a Martian.
They look like Gulliver's Travels.
Yeah.
The previous frame.
Yes, very similar to that. The moon hoax, the great moon hoax of 1834? Basically, there was a series of newspaper articles saying that Herschel had used his telescope to observe creatures living on the moon. And you had, giant moon bats and bipedal beaver and unicorns and things like that. But they were all just the same kinds of creatures you're used to here, but just a little different, bigger, smaller. Wells chose a different approach. Building on his evolutionary theory, he had learned from Huxley. As a student debate of 1885, he had argued the case for mental gigantism and physical atrophy occurring in future human evolution. These future humans became Wells's Martians with huge brains, a few manipulative tentacles, and a digestive system so degraded that they had to inject blood directly into their veins to keep them alive, rather than eating. Now, let's read the passage of the description of the Martians. I think everyone expected to see a man emerge, possibly something a little unlike us terrestrial men, but in all essentials a man. I know I did. But looking, I presently saw something stirring within the shadow. Grayish, billowy movements, one above the other, and then two luminous discs like eyes. Then something resembling a little gray snake, about the thickness of a walking stick, coiled up out of the writhing middle and wriggled in the air towards me. And then another. A sudden chill came over me. There was a loud shriek from a woman behind. I half turned, keeping my eyes fixed upon the cylinder still, from which other tentacles were now projecting, and began pushing my way back from the edge of the pit. I saw astonishment give place to horror on the faces of the people about me. I heard inarticulate exclamations on all sides. There was a general movement backwards. I saw the shopman struggling still against the edge of the pit. I found myself alone and saw the people on the other side of the pit running off, Stent among them. I looked again at the cylinder, and ungovernable terror gripped me. I stood petrified and staring. A large, grayish, rounded bulk, the size perhaps of a bear, was rising slowly and painfully out of the cylinder. As it bulged up, it caught the light, and it glistened like wet leather. Two large, dark-colored eyes were regarding me steadfastly. The mask that framed them, the head of the thing was rounded and had, one might say, a face. There was a mouth under the eyes, a lipless brim which quivered and panted and dripped saliva. The whole creature heaved and pulsated convulsively. A lank tentacle appendage gripped the edge of the cylinder. Another swayed in the air. These aren't people. These are obviously things not from around here. And these are some other interpretations of the Martians. That one's pretty creepy looking. This one's a little more cartoonish. This one, this is from this graphic novel. Ian Eddington and Disraeli's graphic novel of the War of the Worlds. And also he had a sequel called Scarlet Traces, which shows the world after that and when, all the technology that's left after the war. Pretty repulsive creatures, but I think nothing beats the horror of H.G. Wells's own illustration. Isn't that terribly disturbing? The Martians arrived in a huge cylinder blasted from the surface of Mars, much like Jules Verne's Columbiad, from the Earth to the Moon. They open up their cylinder and in short order unleash their terrible heat ray, assemble their tripod war machines, and completely thrash the British Army. He pretty much said he was going to do this in the opening book when he says, "And before we judge them too harshly, we must remember what ruthless and utter destruction our own species has wrought, not only upon animals such as the vanished bison and the dodo, but upon its inferior races." Now, when he used that term, inferior races, you could hear the sarcasm in his voice, because that's what the story is all about. War of the Worlds is about, well, how would you like it if you were the inferior race? The Martians were to dispose a sort of divine justice back upon the British Empire, and the character of the curate was going to comment on that divinity. For those who aren't familiar, the narrator falls in with a clergyman who has, quite frankly, gone insane. Swinging wildly between cloying despair and evangelical ranting, the two become trapped in a house after the falling of another Martian cylinder, and partly from fear of being caught and partly from having had enough of the curate's rantings, the narrator goes at him with a meat cleaver. At the last moment, he turns the blade and strikes him unconscious with the back of the cleaver, only to have his mercy rendered moot as the Martians drag the curate off to drain his blood. Clearly, Wells's disdain for religion plays out a little bit here. The next character in the narrative is that of the artilleryman, the former soldier whose bright idea it is to live underground and form a sort of resistance to eventually rise up and overthrow the Martians. Wells adds a bit of the Invisible Man's character into the artilleryman as he envisions capturing a war machine and taking over the world, the corrupting influence of that absolute power. Finally, I want to touch on the very end and the reprieve offered humanity, but the death of the Martians by native disease. This is not a deus ex machina that provides a happy ending, as appears in most of the other retellings of the story, which I will go over. Wells makes it clear the Martians are still up there, and apparently even mounted an invasion of Venus. Recalling that the Martians left their cooling Mars for a warmer, wetter Earth, Wells is making it clear that someday our time will come. The Earth will cool, and when we start looking sunward for our survival, we may already find the Martians there waiting for us, entrenched. So, I want to touch on some of the... So does anyone have any questions about Wells's story? The War of the Worlds itself, and the things that led up to it. I want to give you an opportunity before I move on to the what other people thought and did with what he had created. Okay.
Sorry,
Yes?
I just wanted to ask, how was the book received? And what did people say
It
at
was
the time?
well received. It originally in 1897 was published in serial form in Pearson's Magazine, and it was well received. Wells was known by this time. His writing up until that point, Island of Dr. Moreau, The Time Machine, those were also well received. So he was riding high, he was making good money, and people loved his stuff. People loved this stuff so much they stole it. Another author of the time, Garrett Serviss, was deciding he was going to cash in on this by writing a sequel. This was made easier in that he pretty much already had a book written, and he only needed to change a few elements to tie the two stories together. So in his story, Edison's Conquest of Mars, the giant vampiric brains made only a momentary appearance at the beginning to be replaced by the real rulers of Mars that were pretty much giant men of the sort that had been common through previous stories. It took me a long time to find a hardcover copy of Edison's Conquest of Mars. It has now been reprinted in paperback in a couple of versions, but it took me a long time to find this. It is not a very good story. It has some really innovative ideas, okay? The first instance of alien abduction, where aliens come and they steal you away kind of thing, is in here. Because when they travel to Mars, Edison builds this spaceship with, super weapons to go and beat up the Martians. When they go to Mars, they discover humans that are being used as slaves that they must liberate from these Martians. So there's at least that innovation there. But for the most part, all that Garrett Serviss did was steal the idea and tack on a little bit of Wells' reference at the beginning. Wells refused to take his lawyer's advice and travel to America for the lawsuit because he didn't want to give Serviss's writing any kind of credit. Better not to have anyone think this has anything to do with War of the Worlds.
Excuse me.
Yes?
I actually have a copy of it too. One thing I liked was how you included all the famous scientists and
Oh,
political
yeah.
leaders at the time. in
Yeah,
there.
everybody gets in on it, except Tesla.
That's true, Tesla.
Garrett Serviss doesn't give Tesla any credit at all. No love for Nikola Tesla. I'm trying to think if there's another story that does use Tesla in a War of the Worlds context. I don't think so. Tesla in a spaceship, yeah, we got some of those, but in a War of the Worlds context, I'm not sure I recall that. There might be a short story. There were a number of anthologies written, short stories about War of the Worlds. I can't remember the titles right. One of the stories is called Night of the Cooters, where a Martian cylinder lands in Texas, and the end is a barbecue. Because there's Texans like, huh, we ain't never had calamari before. On Halloween, October 30th, 1939 at 8 p.m., most radio listeners were listening to the popular NBC program, The Chase and Sanborn Hour, with ventriloquist Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy. Once the first sketch was over, like most listeners today, they began channel surfing and came upon a radio report already in progress. Now let's see if I can hear this. Come on. Let's see if this will play. Come on.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, there's something I haven't mentioned in all this excitement, but it's becoming more distinct. Perhaps you've caught it already on your radio. Listen, please. Do you hear it? The curious humming sound that seems to come from inside the object. I'll move the microphone nearer. Here. Now, we're not more than 25 feet away. Can you hear it now? Professor Pearson?
Yes?
Can you tell us the meaning of that scraping noise inside the thing?
Possibly the unequal cooling of its surface.
I say, do you still think it's a meteor, Professor?
What to think? The metal casing is definitely extraterrestrial. Not found on this Earth. Friction with the Earth's atmosphere usually tears holes in a meteorite. This thing is smooth. And you can see its cylindrical shape.
Something's happening. Ladies and gentlemen, this is terrific. This end of the thing is beginning to flake off. The top is beginning to rotate like a screw, and the thing must be hollow. He's moving! He's back! He's off! The top blew! Ladies and gentlemen, this is all the terrifying thing I've ever witnessed. Wait a minute. Someone calling someone or something. I can see coming out of that black hole two luminous discs. The eyes, it might be his face, might be all the the heavens. Something wiggling out of the shadow like a gray snake. Now it's another one, and another one, and another one. They look like tentacles to me. I can see the thing's body. Now it's large as a bear. It glistens like wet leather, but it's faint. Ladies and gentlemen, it's indescribable. I can hardly force myself to keep looking at it. It's so awful. The eyes are black and gleam like a serpent in the mouth. It's kind of V-shaped with saliva dripping from its windless lips. It seems to quiver and pulsate. And the monster, or whatever it is, can hardly move. It seems weighed down by possibly gravity or something. The thing's rising up now, and the car falls back. It seems plenty. Of course, it's not very serious, ladies and gentlemen. I can't find words. Well, I'll pull this microphone with me as I talk. I'll have to stop the description so I can take a new position. Hold on, will you please? I'll be right back in a minute.
If you close your eyes and imagine, you know, it's 1930s and you're listening to the radio, that is really, really powerful. It gives me chills still. And people were hooked. That was a hook that got them. Holy crap, what's going on? So after a few more minutes of programming, come on, play the next passage.
Ladies and gentlemen, my honor. Ladies and gentlemen, here I am, back of the stone wall that joins Mr. Wilmer's garden. From here, I get a sweep of the whole set.
Oops. I gotta go back. Come on, play the previous
Ladies and gentlemen, my honor. Ladies and gentlemen, here I am, back of a stone wall that joins Miss Wilmer's garden. From here, I get a sweep of the whole...
Come on.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, there's something I haven't mentioned in all this excitement. It's becoming more distinct. Perhaps you've caught it already on your radio. Listen, please.
Yeah, we did this one. This is the one I want. It's a little slow. There we go.
Ladies and gentlemen, my honor. Ladies and gentlemen, here I am, back of a stone wall that joins Miss Wilmer's garden. From here, I get a sweep of the whole scene. I'll give you every detail as long as I can talk and as long as I can see. More state police have arrived. They're drawing up a cordon in front of the pit. About 30 of them. No need to push the crowd back now. They're willing to keep their distance. The captain's conferring with someone. Can't quite see who. Ah, yes, I believe it's Professor Pearson. Yes, it is. Now they've parted, and the professor moves around one side, studying the object while the captain and two policemen advance with something in their hands. I can say it now. It's a white handkerchief tied to a pole. Flag of truce. Those creatures know what that means, what anything means. Wait a minute, something's happening. Some shape is rising out of the pit. I can make out a small beam of light against a mirror. What's that? There's a jet of flame springing from the mirror. The big strike, the advancing men. It strikes them head on. Lord, they're turning into flames. Oh, beautiful, by the wood, the fire, the gas tanks, the automobiles, spreading everywhere. Coming this way now, about 20 yards down that.
And then the panic started. Martians had invaded Grover's Mill, and it wasn't for another half hour after the National Guard had been destroyed, planes had been shot down, the Martians had marched upon New York and used poison gas to kill all its inhabitants, that the announcer came on the air to say that they were listening to a radio drama. The panic caused by Howard Coates' riveting script realistically executed by Orson Welles in the Mercury Theater, and that simple accident of people having missed the introduction at the top of the hour. Except that's not what happened. Now, the story goes, if you've listened, has anyone listened to the War of the Worlds recording? You remember at the beginning, it starts playing. Mercury Theater on the Air presents The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. Da-na-na-na, and they go on with the introduction. But because everybody was watching the show, the other show, Charlie McCarthy and Edgar Bergen, they missed that part. Well, at a science fiction convention a few years back, I had a marvelous opportunity to speak with several emeritus authors, specifically William Tenn and Hal Clement. Each of them had been listening that night in 1938 and in turning to specifically to hear the Mercury Theater. So they knew Mercury Theater had a program every week and they were going to listen to it. So they had their stations tuned to CBS. CBS, to listen to the program. And they didn't hear an announcement. They had the previous program, there was a program of dance music, and then the news reports started. There was no introductory announcement by Orson Welles saying that this was a radio drama. Only the program was interrupted to report explosions on Mars, like a jet of blue flame shot from a gun. Did they realize that it was a dramatization of War of the Worlds? Later, as the drama built, Hal Clement said that the father of one of the friends, so he was going to school, I think, at the time, and he had a bunch of friends. This girl's father called on the phone saying, "What's going on?" He was all concerned. So she said, "Oh God, it's horrible, Dad, there," and then she hung up the phone. So he was in his car driving to rescue his daughter before he realized that it was a radio drama. After the FCC demanded that CBS Well, they came with legal threats and they demanded a recording of the broadcast because no one recorded these broadcasts, only the broadcasters did. And CBS provided a recording with an introduction at the beginning saying, "See, we told everyone." This is the subsequent apology of Orson Welles. Eventually it'll come up.
Is it printed or audio?
This is audio.
Oh.
It's actually video. Hopefully it will. Here we go.
But I know they were. That texture was closer.
What do you think, Mr. Wells?
They have come to consider, I'm of course surprised that the H.G. Wells classic, which is the original for many fantasies about invasions by mythical monsters from the planet Mars, I'm extremely surprised to learn that a story which has become familiar to children through the medium of comic strips and many succeeding novels and adventure stories should have had such an immediate and profound effect upon radio listeners.
He was lying his ass off, and you could see it in his face. He knew exactly what he was doing. Now, he got away with it, to the point where people believe the story that he sold us, that people were just watching another show and missed the introduction that they gave at the beginning. But I know better because I know people who were there. Others weren't so lucky. In 1944, a radio station in Santiago, Chile adapted the Howard Koch strip and set off a panic. In 1949, a radio station in Quito, Ecuador produced an adapted script. When panicked citizens realized that it was not real Martian invasion, they descended upon the radio station and burned it to the ground, killing 15 people, including the scriptwriter. In 1968, a Buffalo radio station prepared for their production of War of the Worlds by blanketing newspapers with press releases and making an on-air announcement every hour, on the hour, for 21 days before Halloween. That night, the radio station police received 4,000 calls believing the broadcast to be true. So, yes, even if there was an announcement at the beginning, I have little doubt the panic would have happened exactly the way that it did. So let's talk about some other stuff that's been done with War of the Worlds. George Pal's version of War of the Worlds brought Martians into the atomic age and gave them a bit of a spin on the Red Menace. While Wells' original character was mostly an observer, fleeing the Martians at every turn and lucky to be alive, Pal had his main character as a scientist on the front lines, trying to come up with some way to battle the Martians. Ultimately, he fails, but it's a very science can solve problems kind of attitude. These are their Martians. Yeah, not too bad. Kind of creepy looking, and I'll buy creepy looking. Not big giant brains, but still creepy looking.
And RGB eyes.
Yes. Now, I don't want to talk much about Steven Spielberg's 2005 version, because honestly, I didn't think there was much to like about it. 1911 references were ham-fisted, and drama wasn't very dramatic. He also got the aliens wrong. Remember Independence Day? They look just like the aliens from Independence Day. They really do, except they walk on 3 legs. Big deal. But I will say one thing about his version. That version got the Martian war machines correct. They are incredible. And the sound. Oh God, that's scary. Such drama, such power, these monstrous machines building up.
Didn't have the Thunder Child.
Yes. Wait till this is over, I can turn the sound off. I love these machines until they start using them. Okay, that's enough of that.
But one of the things I did like about this version was the adaptation of the Thunderchild scene in the original book, which tends to get left out.
Yes, the Thunderchild, the incident with the Thunderchild is left out a lot, and it's used in it's usually used in two ways. Modern interpretations are this kind of a, hey, the humans can do this. We're powerful, we're strong. But in Wells's version, yes, the Thunderchild takes out one of the war machines, but is destroyed in the process. It shows a certain nobility of humanity that these soldiers are, these naval officers are rushing in to save this boat that's trying to escape with refugees. But that's about it.
But even
That's the best they got.
Even our British Navy can't save us.
Even the British Navy can't pull it off. And at the end, we are saved by bacteria. In George Powell's version, there's swelling music and church bells ringing as God saves us with these bacteria. In Orson Welles' version, they do kind of mention that, but with a little more melancholy. Welles, we just got our asses lucky. I want to mention this film. This is a Pendragon film, also from 2005. Now, when I first heard about this, I was really excited because Timothy Hines was going to do War of the Worlds in period. It was going to be 1900 and the Martians invade. And I was really, really looking forward to it. But as I learned more about what this was going to be, and he released little bits and pieces, I became a little more disillusioned. So look at this, look at the fantastic special effects in this. And the acting. He couldn't even get a horse. Okay, so he's riding a cart, and you can hear the horse clopping, but you never see the horse from any angle.
African or European flag?
Somebody's banging coconuts.
And here comes the Martian war machine. Well, he keeps kind of looking, and now he gets terrified. Well, now he gets terrified. Okay, maybe now he gets terrified. God, this is awful.
Does the cart burst into flames?
No, it would be good. Here's some other fantastic special effects and performance and acting.
Very precisely placed.
Yes.
But what year was this?
This was 2005. This was early 2005.
Wow.
The same year as the Tom Cruise version.
They were hoping people would accidentally order this DVD.
Yeah, isn't Pendragon the one that makes copies of all the movies?
There's a whole
Yeah, this was eventually, yes, this got released by Asylum,
Okay.
which makes all sorts of films. As soon as they
Transmorphers.
hear that a movie is going to come out, they make a movie just like it.
Transformers.
Yeah, exactly. All of that stuff. War of the Worlds, however, was a different thing. okay? Asylum eventually released it, but he started out not in that vein. He didn't hear that, you know, Universal was going to do War of the Worlds and jump on the bandwagon, okay? He had this project before that. He just didn't do it very well. And I want to throw one more clip.
They're drinking its blood. The vampires.
Someone has to make 70s laughter doing special effects this year.
Yeah. He looks a little too excited.
Yeah.
Okay. They put, I don't know why they put the electro bondage scene in there. I actually had an online conversation with Timothy Hines. One of the things he did, because this movie was so awful, some years later he recut the film. So he took a lot of the material from it and he turned it into a documentary type film. So as if the War of the Worlds actually happened, we're going to use stock footage of British soldiers and we're going to add some special effects and stuff. I honestly have not seen that yet. But I had a discussion with him when he got online and started trying to promote his film, and I said, wow, I hope this is better than the last one. He didn't like that. The excuse that he gave, well, when it was going on, some of the excuses was that Universal was trying to stop him from making the film because Universal was making their Tom Cruise film. It's like, well, the copyright ran out in 1997 to the story, so Universal couldn't have done anything anyway. His other story, his more recent story, is that his producers came to him and said, hey, you're working on this film, we want to see what you've got so far. So he sent them a rough cut of the film, and then they took that and published it, which I don't buy that. That doesn't sound like, because I saw those effects, and I saw the later effects. I saw his introductory effects. It's like, okay, this is just placeholders, you know, we're testing this, but the War Machine's going to be better. And then I saw the second version, where the War Machine was better, but still pretty sucky. So the idea that you're going to do it again to make it even better just didn't fly with me. The Canadian Broadcasting System a few years back did a War of the Worlds documentary, which I'm pretty sure is much better than Timothy Hines's. Okay, so if you can look that up. I think it streams online somewhere.
It does.
It was there was a
BBC
free version.
America for a while.
What's that?
It was on BBC America.
Yeah, BBC America showed it this year because of the 100th anniversary of the First World War. So this is kind of set in the First World War, where basically the idea is Europe is getting ready to go to war with each other, and then the Martians show up in the middle of Germany, boom. So the Germans are fighting the Russians, it's all this stuff. And it's a pretty good documentary. They make good use of the documentary style. In many ways, like Orson Welles did his documentary style, because these guys were radio. They knew what radio sounded like, so when they did radio, people believed it. Every rebroadcast or recreation of War of the Worlds radio broadcast that I've heard since then doesn't measure up, because most of the time the actors who are doing it don't do radio news. So it doesn't sound like radio news. It sounds like drama, which kind of breaks that suspension, which breaks the power of what Orson Welles was able to do. There are, of course, lots of other films and treatments of War of the Worlds. I just wanted to touch on some of the big ones that people would recognize. This is essentially the end of my presentation. So, hey, I've got the timing right. We've got 10 minutes left, or actually probably about 5 minutes before they start really kicking us out. So, if anyone has any questions, also, all quiet on the Martian front. This is a War of the Worlds miniatures game. So you have Martian war machines and little tanks and stuff like that. I like their Martian. So if you have any questions, please ask. You can come up and look at some of the books and stuff that I've brought. This is my book. And some of the graphic novels and stuff. And I want to thank you for coming. Enjoy the rest of your convention. Oh, and tomorrow, I don't remember when exactly I have it on, 1 o'clock I think, I am doing a presentation on the hollow earth. Because you all know that we're not actually on the surface of a sphere, we are inside a hollow sphere with the sun at the center. Sure we are. Anyway, again, any questions?
How did you come to find out those two authors had actually heard the original broadcast? Because that seems kind of an obscure fact that wouldn't be in their bios or something.
No, well, I knew them. Okay, I knew Hal Clement. Hal Clement is from Pittsburgh area, and I'm from Pittsburgh. Or not Hal Clement, William Tenn. And I also know that William Tenn has written several articles on H.G. Wells and War of the Worlds. He gave a presentation at a local science fiction convention, or a science fiction meeting that I'm a member of. So I already knew his intimate knowledge of the War of the Worlds. But I was at a convention where the both of them, Hal Clement and William Tenn, were there. And we were just sitting in a hotel room talking. It was fantastic to sit and talk to them. They talked about the golden age of science fiction. They talked about what they knew about L. Ron Hubbard. Hal Clement talked about being a bomber pilot during the war. And they also talked about War of the Worlds. And they both told the same story. They were like, oh yeah, I had the same experience. They knew what was coming, and so they were in on it. That's the little secret that I have. So if you want to keep that in mind, that's the secret that no one talks about, is that Orson Welles really did plan to scare the shit out of everyone. Yes, sir?
In view of your mention about the every hour on the hour for 21 days and that sort of thing, you know, sometimes people just kind of misremember too, and end up being oblivious to.
I've heard reports from the 1938 broadcast where they're talking about how it's kind of a revisionist history, that the panic wasn't as bad as all that. And also that people did misremember. There was one story where the woman described, and this was kind of within a year after the event, okay? Within a year they're doing studies, and this woman describes how the most terrifying part was the wave of fire that swept over the United States. I've listened to that broadcast, and unless they cut that part out too, it isn't in there. So yes, people will misremember things. And especially if you're getting these little bits and pieces. You know, you hear the wars, you hear the Martians coming, you hear the cylinder open, you hear the fire stuff, and then you get in your car, and you don't hear the rest of it. You don't hear it after half an hour where the dialogue changes to Professor Pearson doing this monologue of his experiences after the invasion.
They didn't have radios in their car.
They didn't have radios in their car. Well, no, they wouldn't have had radios in the car. But I think what had happened, the father who was going to save his daughter stopped somewhere to like get gas and talk to someone at the gas station. He went like, it's just a radio program. The Great Martian War, 1913, 1917. Yes, that is available. So yeah, you can look that up. Yeah, it's called the Great Martian War. And any other questions? Yes?
Well, actually, I was thinking in terms of Hal Clement.
Yes.
And we met him several times, but it was in his advanced years, and still just such a sweetheart.
Oh yeah, marvelous.
But you know, you're depending a lot on his memory of whether there was the intro or not. True.
But the fact that I've got William Tenn as well, Okay, it's not just one of these guys, it's two of these guys who were science fiction authors at the time. They knew science fiction, they knew War of the Worlds, they were familiar with this stuff, and they were listening to the radio because they knew Orson Welles was going to do something. So I give them a whole lot of trust because they corroborate each other's stories. If I just heard one of them, I would go, huh, well, maybe that's true. But the two of them together, and to watch Orson Welles talk to us saying, I can't understand how people would misconstrue this as something, you know, it's like, come on. You gotta look at Orson Welles' career and go, yeah, he was dicking us off. All of us. And laughing the whole time. Okay, so I don't see any more questions, so again, we got 5 more minutes before they kick them out. Open the door so that they know that they can kick us out, and then come up and if you want to take a look at this stuff that I have while I start packing up. Ah! Did I break something? No, I just